The quiet banks of Mythif, you were to wander through the ancient landscapes of Greece. Long before the worry of cities and the shuffle of sandals along marble-paved streets, you would eventually find yourself walking along the banks of rivers that carried both water and whispers. The Greeks did not see rivers as simply physical flows of water. To them, a river was a presence, a deity, and a teacher. Its voice was carried in ripples. Its patience measured in the centuries it carved through valleys, and its restfulness captured in the gentle hush of water against stone. It is here, beside rivers, that the Greeks believed mortals could learn something quite unusual: how to nap properly. You may not expect a civilization famous for its philosophers, warriors, and temples to devote such reverence to napping. But the Greeks saw sleep not just as a human need, but as a realm where gods and mortals brushed against one another. And among the teachers of this delicate art were the nymphs, those quiet daughters of water, wood, and meadow, whose lives were long, whose habits were serene, and whose lessons, though unhurried, endured in myth and memory. Rivers as homes of nymphs in Greek thought. Every river had a personality. The Sperchios in Thessaly, the Achelos in western Greece, and the Ilissos winding quietly past Athens were not just waterways, they were beings. The larger ones were called river gods, powerful in their flow and stubborn in their turns. But along their banks lived their companions and daughters, the Naiads, freshwater nymphs, whose role was not to command, but to accompany. The Naiads were believed to guard fountains, brooks, and river bends. Their task was humble: to keep water flowing, to refresh the land, and to offer shade to travelers who wandered too long under the sun. To the practical Greek farmer or shepherd, these shaded spots by rivers were more than divine, they were necessary. Flocks needed rest. Shepherds, after hours of keeping watch, needed somewhere to lie down. And fields, after being watered, became places of ease. Thus, the nymphs became associated with quiet afternoons, when a breeze stirred the reeds and the air grew heavy with drowsiness. Stories told of mortals who stumbled upon them resting by the water, reclining against smooth stones, or letting their hair float upon the surface of a stream as they dozed. The lesson was simple but profound. Even the divine paused. Even the ever-living found stillness, and mortals, who often hurried and worried, could do well to imitate this rhythm. The Greek view of sleep in the Greek world was not merely rested, was a domain ruled by its own deities. Hypnos, the god of sleep, drifted gently upon his wings, carrying slumber like a soft fog over human eyes. His twin, Thanatos, represented death, making the connection between sleep and mortality a familiar theme in Greek thought. Dreams themselves were shepherded by Morpheus and his brothers, who shaped them into visions that could warn, comfort, or confuse. For ordinary people, though, sleep was less divine mystery and more a necessary pause in daily toil. Farmers rose early, worked under the sun, and found brief reprieves in shade or under olive trees. Soldiers marched long hours, but between campaigns found themselves leaning against shields, dozing with helmets tipped over their faces. Philosophers argued in the agora, but even they could be found reclining during the hot noon, eyes closed in thought or drowsiness. The Greeks did not have beds in the modern sense. They had couches, pallets, or woven mats, often spread wherever sleep demanded. Naps, small, unceremonious stretches of rest, were part of the rhythm of life, and rivers, with their cooling breezes and lulling sounds, provided some of the best places for this practice. The practical charm of river napping. Why, then, did rivers become such favored spots? Part of the answer lies in geography. Much of Greece was rocky, mountainous, and exposed. Shade was a luxury, and water sources were scattered. A river bend with a willow or a plane tree offered both shade and a place to cool off. It was practical to pause there, to drink, to let animals graze nearby, and to surrender for a short while to stillness. But there was also psychology at work. The sound of water is rhythmic, repetitive, and soothing. The Greeks, though they did not describe it in modern terms, understood its effect. To listen to a river was to allow the mind to drift. The constant yet gentle noise provided cover from harsher sounds and gave the body permission to relax. Shepherds could nap knowing their sheep would not stray far from water. Farmers could rest with the reassurance that crops were being nourished nearby. Even travelers, wearied from miles of walking, could trust that the same river they drank from would guard their slumber. Thus, the habit formed to nap beside rivers. Not just anywhere, not in the dust of a road or in the bustle of a marketplace, but in places where water moved steadily, watched by nymphs who embodied the spirit of calm. Nymphs, as teachers of rest, the myths framed this habit in stories of guidance. A weary mortal might stumble upon a naiad who encouraged him to lie down. A young shepherd, restless and anxious about his flock, could be lulled into stillness by the gentle singing of a nymph. A traveler might resist closing his eyes, fearing robbers or wild animals, but in the presence of these river guardians, he could surrender safely. Nymphs were not fearsome figures. Unlike gods who punished hubris or demanded sacrifices, nymphs were closer to the everyday. They whispered rather than thundered. Their lessons were not commandments, but habits. In this way, they embodied something deeply human. The ability to live long, uneventful lives filled with ordinary rhythms of water and rest. And to the Greeks, this ordinariness was its own kind of wisdom. Cultural echoes of napping. You look closely at Greek culture. You see echoes of this riverside napping practice. The tradition of the siesta in Mediterranean societies, though more associated with later Roman and Spanish customs, has roots in the simple truth that afternoons in hot climates invite stillness. Greek pottery sometimes depicts reclining figures, not always in grand feasts, but in quiet moments. Literature, too, hints at pauses during journeys or battles, where even heroes lie down beside rivers before resuming their tasks. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey contain scenes of sleep near rivers. Soldiers rest by the Scamander before battles, and Odysseus himself is found sleeping beside streams after shipwrecks. While not always framed as lessons from nymphs, the cultural memory aligns. Rivers were places where humans regained strength. The mythic framing nymphs teaching mortals to nap was a poetic way of acknowledging what ordinary life already proved, that survival required pauses, and that rivers provided the safest and most natural settings for these pauses. An example, the river Ilissosteik. For instance, the river Ilissos near Athens. In Plato's dialogue, Phaedrus, Socrates, and Phaedrus go walking and find themselves beside this quiet riverbank. Socrates, known for his endless questioning, pauses to remark on the beauty of the place, the shade, the water, the calm. Though the dialogue continues into philosophical debate, the setting itself reflects the tradition. It is by water, in stillness, that conversation and thought deepen, one can imagine. Before the philosophers spoke, ordinary Athenians lying down in that same shade, perhaps with the faint splash of water against reeds as their lullaby. The nymphs of the Ilissos were said to dwell there, and to the locals. Their presence explained why the place was so welcoming to rest. Lessons from mortals, what did it mean, though, to be taught by nymphs? The lesson was not dramatic. It was not about glory or conquest. It was about accepting small rhythms of life. Drink when thirsty, pause when weary, and let yourself sleep when the moment invites it. The Greeks, so concerned with balance between work and leisure, between discipline and pleasure, saw this as part of the greater order. To nap beside a river was to recognize one's place in the world, dependent on water, subject to fatigue, and capable of renewal. It was not weakness, but wisdom, a quiet question, as the myths remind us, mortals who ignored the rhythms of life often fell to exhaustion, arrogance, or folly. But those who listened to nymphs, who allowed themselves rest, endured, and so, in these quiet tales, a curious question lingers: if even immortals, like nymphs, found time to lie down beside rivers, what might mortals risk losing if they refused such simple pauses? Mortals, myths, and drowsy encounters. Section 1 gave us the setting, the rivers, the nymphs, and the calm rhythms of water. Then this section brings us closer to the actual encounters between mortals and these elusive teachers of rest. The Greeks, after all, did not leave their lessons in abstractions. They clothed them in stories, gave them characters, and told of ordinary men who stumbled upon extraordinary stillness. The shepherd and the Neaduang. Of the quieter myths tells of a shepherd named Callistos who tended his flock along the Achelos River. His days were long, his watch unrelenting. For wolves roamed the edges of the forest, and bandits sometimes crossed the hills. He was known among his fellow herders as diligent, but also anxious. He rarely sat down, let alone closed his eyes during the day. According to the story, a naiad of the Achelos noticed him pacing endlessly. She grew curious, for shepherds usually stopped by the water to drink and often lay in the grass, while their flocks grazed. She appeared to him one afternoon in the form of a young woman crowned with wreaths, and asked him why he never rested. Callistos confessed that he feared losing even a single sheep. The nymph listened, then invited him to sit beneath a willow. She promised to watch over his flock for a short while. Though doubtful, Callistos finally reclined, and as the sound of the river filled his ears, he drifted into sleep. When he woke, his sheep were safe, grazing near the water, and the nymph was gone. From that day on, the tale says, he allowed himself a short nap each afternoon, trusting the rhythm of the river. The moral was subtle but clear. Even vigilance must bend to rest. Constant wakefulness weakens rather than strengthens. Odysseus and the comfort of Streamsea. More famous stories of Greek literature also nod to this riverside habit. In Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus, shipwrecked and weary, washes ashore on the land of the Phaeacians. After crawling from the sea, he collapses in the reeds beside a river. There, exhausted, he sleeps deeply until morning. Though Homer does not describe a naiad explicitly appearing, the implication is strong. Rivers are guardians, offering safety and calm. Odysseus, surrounded by danger and uncertainty, is granted a reprieve in the lap of water and grass. Later poets expanded the scene, imagining nymphs watching over him as he slept, shielding him from harm until Nausicaa, daughter of the Phaeacian king, discovers him. The ordinary Greek listener, hearing this story, would recognize the truth beneath the epic. Travelers, too, must nap, and the best place for it is beside water, where the gods' daughters linger unseen. Heracles and the river Achelos, not all encounters were so peaceful. Heracles, the hero famed for his labors, once fought the river god Achelos for the hand of Deianira. Their battle was fierce, filled with transformations and broken horns. Yet some versions of the tale add a quieter moment before the fight. Heracles, traveling long and weary, is said to have lain down on the banks of the river to rest. The naiads, daughters of Achelous, are imagined as watching him. Some pity his fatigue, others whisper about his strength. Though the story quickly shifts to combat, that pause, Heracles, sleeping by the river before rising to face his rivalry, minds us that even the strongest men must rest. Greek audiences, hearing this, would not have missed the point if Heracles himself closed his eyes beside a stream. Mortals of lesser strength surely could as well. The cultural role of sleepy myths. Why were these stories told? Partly, they reflected lived reality. Shepherds did nap. Travelers did rest by rivers. Storytellers, observing this, wove divine explanation around it. If a man was found asleep in the grass by a riverbank, it was easier on more poetic say he had been lulled by a nymph than to say he was simply tired. But there was also moral instruction. Greek culture valued moderation, neither too much indulgence nor too much denial. To sleep excessively was laziness, but to refuse rest was arrogance. The nymphs embodied this balance, teaching mortals to pause just long enough. The myths, then, reinforced cultural wisdom. They reminded listeners that strength came not only from effort, but from renewal. The river, with its endless flow, symbolized this. It never ceased, yet it did so by constant, steady motion, not by frantic rushing. Mortals were to imitate this rhythm. Nymphs as safe guardians, the Greeks also lived with fears, wild animals, raids, illness, sudden storms. To nap in the open was a risk. By attributing safety to the presence of nymphs, the culture reassured itself. One could sleep by the river because it was watched over. The naiads, though rarely interfering in dramatic events, provided a sense of protection in the ordinary. Some local traditions even involved small offerings to river nymphs before resting. A shepherd might toss a crumb of bread into the water, or a traveler might leave a pebble on a stone. These tokens were gestures of respect, quiet contracts that said, "Watch over me as I close my eyes." A story from Arcadia, land of mountains and pastoral life. There is a lesser-known tale of a young girl named Philea. She carried water from a spring each day, and one afternoon, overwhelmed by the heat, she fell asleep beside the source. Her parents, frantic when she did not return, found her hours later, unharmed and smiling in her slumber. When they woke her, she spoke of a dream in which a nymph had braided her hair and told her to rest. This tale was retold in villages as proof that the nymphs cared for ordinary children, not just heroes or shepherds. It reinforced the idea that to nap beside water was not neglectful, but blessed. The philosophical Angevin philosophers, who often elevated everyday habits into questions of virtue, noticed the significance of riverside repose. Plato, as mentioned in Phaedrus, used the Ilisos as a setting for dialogue, where the beauty of the place encouraged reflection. Later, thinkers drew parallels between the flow of water and the flow of thought, between the pause of rest and the pause required for contemplation. To nap, then, was not only physical but mental. It allowed the mind to reset, just as the river continually renewed itself. By placing nymphs in this role, myth connected the act of sleep to the broader order of nature and the divine. Lingering curiosity of these stories, quiet though they are, circle around a central idea that rest is taught, not instinctive. Mortals, driven by fear, duty, or ambition, resist it. The nymphs intervene gently, insisting that even vigilance has limits. Their lessons endure because they are small, repeatable truths. Yet, as we gather these myths together, another question stirs. If mortals so often resisted rest, what did the Greeks fear about sleep itself? And why did they need divine figures to give permission for something so natural? Sleep, mortality, and the eternal flow. When we look back at the myths of nymphs teaching mortals to nap beside rivers, the tales may seem gentle, almost trivial, mere folklore, to explain the ordinary act of lying down by water. But to the Greeks, the act of sleeping by a river reached into something far deeper. It touched on mortality, renewal, and the awareness that humans, fragile and brief, lived within the larger rhythms of nature. Sleep as a mirror of death for the Greeks. Sleep was not a neutral condition. Hypnos, the god of sleep, was the twin of Thanatos, the god of death. This pairing was not coincidence. To fall asleep was to mimic death, the closing of eyes, the surrender of control, the drifting away from the waking world. Napping by a river then carried symbolic weight. Rivers themselves were liminal places. They marked boundaries between regions, between cultivated land and wild country, even between life and death. The most famous river of all, the Styx, was the crossing point into the underworld. To rest beside a river was to linger on the edge of that boundary, flirting with stillness that resembled death. but from which one would rise again, renewed. Thus, when myths described mortals being lulled into slumber by naiads, listeners would have recognized the quiet double meaning. These mortals were practicing in small and harmless ways for the greater sleep that awaited all, and the nymphs, in their kindness, ensured that this rehearsal was peaceful rather than fearful. The river, as time, the Greeks also saw rivers as metaphors for time itself. Heraclitus, the philosopher of change, famously declared that one cannot step into the same river twice, for the water is always moving. To nap by a river was therefore to place oneself alongside time, to surrender briefly as water flowed on, indifferent and eternal. A shepherd who dozed for an hour by the Acheloes might wake to find the river unchanged, though his own body was restored. This contrast reminded mortals of their place in the universe, fleeting, but held within something steady. The river carried on as generations came and went, and the act of sleeping beside it was an acknowledgement of that permanence. Rituals of rest in some part of Greece. Evidence suggests that resting by rivers had ritual significance. Archaeologists have found small offerings near springs and riverbanks, pottery shards, and figurines, while some were offerings for water itself. Others may have been gestures of thanks for safety during travel or rest. A weary traveler who survived a nap without harm might return the next day to leave a token. Shepherds, before closing their eyes, might whisper words of gratitude to unseen guardians. The myths of nymphs reinforced these habits, giving shape to otherwise practical customs. To honor the nymphs was to acknowledge the fragile trust placed in sleep. Greek medicine and sleep by water. The Greeks also connected riverside rest to health. Hippocratic texts note that certain environments were more conducive to recovery. Shaded places, cool breezes, and fresh water. Physicians observe that patients slept more soundly in such conditions, though their explanations lacked modern physiology. Their observations aligned with lived reality. The lull of water, the lowering of temperature, and the stillness of air near rivers all contributed to deeper sleep. For societies without mechanical comfort, this knowledge was essential. Myth and medicine thus intertwined. The nymphs were guardians of health, not only in poetry, but in practical experience. From myths to everyday life, as centuries passed, myths of naiads and rivers did not vanish. Even in Hellenistic and Roman times, the idea of riverside repose endured. Poets wrote of reclining by streams. Farmers continued to nap in the shade. Children still dozed beside fountains while playing. What began as myth became custom, and what began as custom became memory. The Greeks lived in close proximity to their land, and their stories served not only to entertain, but to encode survival strategies. To pause by water, to rest during heat, to let the body recover, these were practices that extended life. And myth, by wrapping these truths in divine imagery, ensured they would not be forgotten. The broader lesson, when we draw back from the detail of these tales, what remains is a simple rhythm: effort, pause, renewal. The nymphs taught mortals to nap, not because sleep was mysterious, but because mortals often resisted it. In a world of labor, war, and ambition, rest could seem like weakness. Myth corrected this view. By portraying rest as sacred, watched over by daughters of rivers, the Greeks affirmed that even the simplest act of closing one's eyes carried meaning. This lesson, quiet though it is, reaches us across centuries. In a culture that valued balance, riverside napping was not trivial. It was a reminder of humility. Mortals were fragile, yes, but in accepting fragility, they aligned themselves with the eternal. Reflection at the riverbanks. So picture it again. A Greek shepherd, his sheep grazing nearby, reclining under a plane tree. The river murmurs, a dragonfly hovers. He closes his eyes, trusting both his flock and his life to unseen guardians. He may not know the name of the nymph who lingers there, but he honors her with his stillness when he wakes. The world is the same. Water still flowing, sheep still grazing, the sun still moving across the sky. But he himself is different, restored, renewed, and reminded that even brief moments of surrender sustain the long journey of life. The Greeks knew that rivers carried lessons, and among the quietest of those lessons was this: that pausing to rest was not an interruption of life, but part of its very rhythm. Closing thought and so. The myths of nymphs teaching mortals to nap beside rivers are not grand epics of conquest or tragedy. They are soft stories woven into daily life, about the acceptance of weariness and the embrace of renewal. But they leave us with a final question, one that lingers like the murmur of water itself. If the ancients could find wisdom in the simplest act of closing their eyes by a stream, what lessons might we, in our restless age, overlook in the pauses we refuse to take? The god of groves and the sound of morning, if the rivers of Greece whispered lullabies through their flowing water, then the hills and meadows carried their own musica, piping sound, sharp yet sweet, that belonged to a figure as rustic as he was restless, Pan. To the Greeks, Pan was not a god of cities or temples. He belonged to the countryside, to the wild places where goats grazed, shepherds wandered, and echoes lived between the hills. Pan was not handsome like Apollo or mighty like Zeus. He was half man and half goat, with horns that curved from his brow and legs that ended in hooves. His domain was not Olympus, but the woods and meadows. He was, in a sense, the embodiment of nature's untamed rhythms, sometimes playful, sometimes startling, always present where the land stretched wide and empty. Among his many associations, Pan was most famous for his music. The flute he played. The syrinx was fashioned from reeds and carried a thin, high sound. Unlike the grand lyres of Apollo or the booming instruments of festivals, Pan's flute was simple, portable, and tied directly to the landscape. Reeds grew by rivers and marshes waiting to be cut and shaped. Shepherds, spending long hours in solitude, found comfort in its notes. But music, in the ancient world, was never just entertainment. It was functional, instructive, and woven into the routines of daily life. And so Pan's flute became, in stories and in custom, not only an instrument of leisure, but also a kind of signals, something like an alarm clock. Long before such devices were imagined, Pan and the dawn, the Greeks imagined Pan roaming at dawn, his pipes echoing across valleys. For shepherds, this sound was familiar, for they too used flutes to rouse their animals or to signal one another. Across fields, a melody piercing the stillness of early morning could awaken both flocks and men. To hear Pan's music at sunrise was to feel nature itself stirring. Birds took flight, goats rose from their crouches, and shepherds shook off sleep. Myth described Pan as calling life into movement each day, not with thunder or command, but with the thin insistence of reed pipes. In this way, Pan's flute became linked to the idea of waking. Just as roosters crowed at dawn, Pan's notes were thought to ripple through the countryside, ensuring that no one lingered too long in slumber. Whether literally heard or imagined in story, the sound carried the authority of morning itself. The shepherd's life, to understand why this mattered, one must imagine the life of a Greek shepherd. It was not glamorous work. Shepherds lived outdoors, most of the time moving flocks from one patch of grass to another. They carried food in simple pouches, wore rough cloaks, and relied on staffs for guidance and defense. Their schedules were dictated by the animals. At dawn, sheep and goats needed to be roused and led toward pastures. By midday, they were gathered into shade. At evening, they returned to folds for safety. The shepherd himself rose with the sun, not out of luxury, but necessity. Meant risking the flock. 4 goats could wander off, and sheep could be snatched by predators. In this rhythm, music was a tool. Flutes could call animals, calm them, or coordinate movements. A sharp note could serve as a signal to wake. Thus, the idea that Pan's flute itself was an element unseen, God reminding mortals to rise, was not far from the truth. The myth of Syrinx Pan's flute carried a story of its own, one that explained both its origin and its haunting tone. Syrinx was a nymph who fled from Pan's advances. When he pursued her, she prayed to the river gods for escape, and they transformed her into reeds. Pan, frustrated but awed, cut the reeds and bound them together, creating the instrument that bore her name. Every note Pan played, therefore, was a voice of Syrinx herself, soft, high, and slightly mournful. The Greeks said that when Pan's flute sounded at dawn, it was not only a summons to rise, but also a reminder of this tale. The shepherd, hearing it, knew that nature itself was filled with stories of pursuit, transformation, and adaptation. The flute's association with Syrinx added another layer. Its notes were a fusion of longing and necessity. To wake at dawn was sometimes wearisome, but the melody gave it shape. Life in the countryside was not all joy, nor was it all sorrow. It was both mixed together like the tones of Pan's simple instrument. Echoes across the hills, the countryside of Greece was filled with echoes. Hills and valleys repeated sounds, often distorting them. The Greeks attributed these echoes to another nymph, aptly named Echo, who lingered in lonely places. When Pan played, his notes did not vanish. They returned, reshaped, as if the land itself were answering. For shepherds, this effect was practical. A call sent across a valley could return to them, reassuring them of its strength. A flute's melody, repeated faintly by hills, could carry much farther than a voice. This echoing quality made Pan's instrument seem even more like an alarm, its sound bouncing across great distances, impossible to ignore. Thus, Pan's music became an emblem of wakefulness in the open land. Where there was echo, there was life. Where there was music, there was motion. A practical, alarm-while myth attributed the sound to Pan. In daily life, shepherds themselves used flutes in similar ways. A sharp melody could startle animals into rising. A tune could guide them toward water or pasture. Over time, communities may have blended this practical knowledge with divine storytelling. To say that Pan wakes the countryside is a poetic way of saying that the land itself had its own rhythms, its own alarms. Humans did not invent the need to rise early. Nature demanded it. Pan, as nature embodied, became the figure who reminded mortals of this fact. The humor of the tale. Story of Pan's flute as a kind of alarm carried a note of humor, too. The Greeks often used Pan as a figure of rustic amusement, contrasting him with the polished gods of Olympus. While Apollo's lyre summoned harmony and beauty, Pan's pipes squealed through the hills, practical but lacking refinement to imagine. Such music as a divine alarm clock was to smile at its rustic bluntness, and yet humor did not erase reverence. The Greeks could laugh at Pan while still acknowledging his power. He startled armies with sudden shouts, giving rise to the word panic, yet he also calmed flocks with his melodies. His music was both clumsy and essential, much like life in the countryside itself. A question awakes so as dawn spread across the hills and Pan's flute echoed through valleys. Shepherds rose, flocks stirred, and the day began. But the myths leave us with a quiet question. Did mortals truly hear Pan, or was his music simply their own flutes, reimagined in story? The Greeks, perhaps, did not worry about the distinction. For them, the boundary between mortal habit and divine presence was thin, like morning mist, to rise at dawn to the sound of pipes, whether Pan's or a shepherd's, was simply to join the rhythm of the world. Startled armies, sleepy shepherds, and the pipes of Panda, flute of Pan was not always gentle. Though it could soothe goats and amuse shepherds, its notes also carried an edgeroll, sudden, and capable of startling anyone who heard them unexpectedly. In fact, one of Pan's greatest powers was the ability to incite terror. A sudden fright so overwhelming that it gave us the very word. Panic. This makes his flute's role as a shepherd's alarm clock all the more curious. For while the sound of Pan's pipes could nudge a shepherd awake at dawn, it could also make entire armies tremble in fear. The Greeks, fond of weaving humor into their myths, seemed to delight in the idea that one rustic god could serve as both a divine wake-up call and the source of chaos on the battlefield. The power of sudden sounding the ancient world, silence, was common. Without the hum of engines or the whir of electronics, the countryside at night could be astonishingly quiet. A sudden burst of flute notes in the early morning, therefore, carried much more weight than it might today. Imagine lying beneath the stars after a long day of herding goats. The night is dark and still, punctuated only by the occasional bleat or rustle. Then, just as the first light creeps over the hills, a piercing tune cuts across the valley. To us, it might seem like a simple flute. To the shepherd, it was unmistakably a sign that the world itself was stirring. This power of sound, the ability to break silence, was central to Pan's identity. He was not a god of thunder or lightning. His strength was subtler, rooted in the sharpness of contrast. Just as sudden music could jolt a sleeper awake, sudden fright could scatter an army. Pan and the Battle of Marathon, perhaps the most famous story of Pan's frightening power, comes from the Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE, according to Herodotus. The Athenians claimed that Pan appeared during their struggle against the Persians. Though unseen, his presence spread fear among the enemy troops, helping to secure a Greek victory. The Athenians were so grateful that they built a shrine to Pan at the base of the Acropolis, honoring him not as a rustic nuisance, but as a god who could sway the tides of war. Here, Pan's sound was not an alarm to wake a shepherd, but a kind of supernatural trumpet, calling men to alertness and scattering their foes. And yet, in retelling this tale, one can imagine the humor that Greeks might have found in it. The same pipes that roused goats at dawn were, in a sense, rousing soldiers on the battlefield. The divine alarm clock had many hues, some pastoral, others political. Shepherds and their alarms for ordinary shepherds, Pan's pipes, were not about battles, but about routines. They carried flutes of their own, carved from reeds or fashioned from bone. The notes were high and thin, perfect for carrying across distances. One shepherd might pipe a tune to signal that it was time to move the flock. Another might play at dawn to stir his animals and remind a fellow herder to rise from his cloak of sleep. The line between divine myth and human practice blurred here. To say that Pan's flute was the alarm was another way of saying that shepherds themselves lived by the music of the pipes. In this sense, Pan embodied the shepherd's daily reality. His music was not a luxury, it was a necessity. To keep flocks together, to wake at dawn, to move with the rhythm of the landau required sound. The startle and the smile, the Greeks loved contrasts. They delighted in stories where humor and seriousness mingled, where a god could be both revered and laughed at. Pan was a perfect example. One story tells of a traveler passing through Arcadia who heard Pan's pipes in the early morning mist. Startled awake, he leapt to his feet, convinced he had overslept and lost his way. Only later did he realize it was merely the piping of a shepherdor, perhaps. The god himself echoing across the hills. Another tale spoke of Pan sneaking up on napping shepherds. With a sudden burst of notes, he would startle them awake, then vanish into the thickets, leaving behind only laughter and echoes. These stories gave Pan a mischievous quality, like a rustic trickster who refused to let anyone sleep too long in his groves. Ritual and reverence despite the humor. Pan was treated with respect. In Arcadia, his birthplace, shrines to Pan dotted the landscape. Shepherds left offerings of milk, honey, or small cakes. In return, they hoped for protection over their flocks, and, perhaps, a more gentle tune from his pipes. Morning prayers, sometimes, invoked Pan directly, asking him to guide the day's herding. If his music was an alarm, it was also a blessing. To rise at dawn to the sound of the pipes was not just to wake it, was to begin the day under the watch of a god. The flute as companion for the shepherd himself. The flute was more than a tool. It was company. Long days in the fields were lonely, filled with silence except for the rustle of animals. A flute could fill that silence, turning boredom into melody. Some shepherds composed little tunes of their own, weaving rhythms from memory. Others imitated the sounds of birds or streams. The line between shepherd and Pan blurred once again if mortals played pipes in the hills. Was it any wonder that myths imagined Pan playing too? The flute, in this sense, was a bridge between human life and divine imagination. To play was to participate in the gods' music. To hear was to share in the landscape's rhythm. The dual alarmso, Pan's flute, was both alarm and amusement, both a call to rise and a trick to startle. In one story, it saved Athens. In another, it teased a drowsy shepherd. In every case, it carried the power of sound itself, the power to turn silence into action. For the Greeks, this duality made perfect sense. Life was rarely one thing alone. Morning was both welcome and wearisome. Flutes were both helpful and irritating, and gods were both divine and ridiculous. To say that Pan's pipes were mistaken for a shepherd's alarm clock was not just a joke. It was a reflection of life's mixture of reverence and laughter, a question of echoes, as the myths suggest. Not every sound could be trusted. Was it a shepherd playing his flute, or was it Pan himself? Was the startle of dawn a mortal's tune, or the god's mischief? The Greeks left such questions open, perhaps because the answer mattered less than the story. What they knew for certain was that sound had power. It woke sleepers, moved armies, and bound mortals to the rhythm of the land. Whether Pan or shepherd, flute or alarm, the effect was the same. Life stirred and silence ended. From rustic pipes to timeless echoes, the stories of Pan's flute half-divine trick. Half-shepherd's tool did not vanish with the hills of Arcadia. Over centuries, the sound of his pipes carried into new landscapes, new imaginations, and new metaphors. What began as a shepherd's dawn tune, mistaken for an alarm clock of sorts, became something much larger, a symbol of wakefulness, rhythm, and the gentle nudge of life itself. From Arcadia To the world Arcadia, Pan's homeland, was known to the Greeks as a place of rustic simplicity. Mountains, valleys, and flocks defined its landscape. But as Greek culture spread, so too did Pan's music. His image appeared not only in shrines in Arcadia, but also in sculptures, pottery, and later Roman gardens. The Romans embraced Pan under another name, Faunus. Like Pan, Faunus was a rustic god who wandered fields and forests, piping tunes that startled mortals awake. Roman poets enjoyed comparing his pipes to the rhythms of daily life, sometimes cheerful, sometimes unsettling. By the time pastoral poetry flourished, especially in works by Virgil. The idea of music waking shepherds at dawn had become a well-worn motif. The flute of Pan no longer belonged solely to Arcadian hills. It was everywhere, always playing, always carrying its rustic associations. The flute and the passage of time. The Greeks did not measure time the way we do, with mechanical precision. Sundials and water clocks existed, but the rhythms of life followed. Natural cues, the rising sun, the call of birds, the bleating of sheep. Among these cues, sound played a special role. Pan's flute became, in a sense, a marker of time. The shrill piping at dawn suggested a new day had begun. The softer melodies at dusk suggested that it was ending. In this way, Pan's music served the same purpose as an alarm clock, though instead of metal bells or digital tones, it was reeds, breath, and imagination. To call his flute a shepherd's alarm was not only humorous, it was accurate. Shepherds awoke, flocks stirred, and days unfolded in step with music. The sound was both functional and symbolic, reminding mortals that time moved whether they wished it or not. Echoes in later traditions, even after the gods of Olympus faded, Pan's pipes lingered in memory. Medieval writers occasionally mentioned him in allegories, though often with suspicion. Rustic gods were viewed as pagan remnants. Still, the image of the shepherd's flute endured. Renaissance poets revived Pan with enthusiasm, treating his pipes as symbols of pastoral simplicity. To them, Pan's music represented an escape from noisy cities and a return to nature's rhythms. Painters, too, loved the image of Pan reclining under a tree, flute in hand, his notes drifting into a calm landscape. By the Romantic era, Pan had become almost wistful, a reminder of lost innocence, of simpler times when shepherds woke to melodies rather than clocks. Writers like Shelley and Keats invoked him as a figure of both inspiration and nostalgia. Through it all, the idea of Pan's flute as a kind of alarm endured. Even in poetry, the sound of pipes was a signal of awakening, whether of mourning, of imagination, or of memory itself. The humor of the god, yet the Greeks themselves might have laughed at how seriously later generations treated Pan. For them, he was both sacred and silly. His flute was not only a divine instrument, it was also an endless source of amusement. To call it an alarm clock was to acknowledge this humor. Unlike Zeus with his thunderbolts, or Apollo with his polished lyre, Pan's power lay in something rustic and ridiculous, a handful of reeds bound with wax. That such a humble object could startle armies or wake shepherds amused the Greeks greatly. It was as if the gods were reminding mortals that power need not be grand. Sometimes it was shrill, awkward, and even a little embarrassing, and yet worked. People rose, armies scattered, and goats bleated in time. The sleepy side of Pan, for all his startling power. Pan was also a god of rest. He was said to sleep. At noon, stretched in the shade, his pipes set aside. Shepherds, too, observed a midday quiet. To disturb Pan at this time was considered dangerous. His wrath could bring sudden fright upon the unlucky. This duality made Pan's flute especially fitting as a sleep story. It was both the call to rise and the permission to rest. Just as dawn stirred the fields, noon hushed them again. Pan's rhythms mirrored life's ebb and flow, reminding mortals that time was not only about waking neat, was also about sleeping. The eternal alarm today. Alarm clocks ring with metallic urgency. Phones vibrate with insistent tones. Yet if we listen closely in poetry, in music, in imagination, we can still hear Pan's pipes. The rustic alarm has not vanished. It lingers in stories, reminding us that once upon a time, shepherds rose not to machines, but to reeds and breath. The myth endures because it captures something universal. All of us know the feeling of being woken suddenly, sometimes amused, sometimes annoyed. All of us know the rhythm of days, the passage of time marked by sound. In this, Pan's flute is timeless. To mistake it for a shepherd's alarm clock is not really a mistake at all. It is the recognition that music, whether divine or human, shapes our lives. It wakes us, startles us, and ushers us gently into each new day. Closing echo. So, when the Greeks told tales of panpiping at dawn, they were not only laughing at a rustic god, they were also reminding themselves of the rhythms that guided life, sleep, and waking, silence and sound, night and day. Pan's flute was both mischief and necessity. It was both joke and truth. It startled, it soothed, it mocked, it blessed, and above all, it played forever echoing across valleys and centuries. If you close your eyes now, perhaps you can imagine it, the thin, reedy tune carrying over hills, tugging gently at the edge of sleep. Not harsh, not cruel, but insistent. In its way, just enough to wake a shepherd, just enough to stir a dream, and perhaps the music seems distant. You need not rise. For unlike the alarm clocks of today, Pan's flute was never precise. It was rustic, meandering, a little playful. It did not demand it, suggest it. A sound, half real, half imagined, drifting in the morning air. And in that softness, it still plays. Starlight over Istanbul when we imagine the night skies of the Ottoman Empire. It is tempting to think of vast domes, golden mosques, and minarets pointing heavenward like fingers raised toward the stars. The empire, which stretched at its height across 3 continents, was as much about science as it was about power. And among its quieter achievements was astronomy, the careful study of celestial movements, written down by scholars who sometimes wore turbans, sometimes robes, and, if stories are to be believed, often their pajamas dot the Ottoman nighting, the bustling capital of Istanbul. The day was noisy. Merchants called from bazaars. Ferries crossed the Bosporus, and prayers rose 5 times daily from countless mosques. But the night belonged to the astronomers. After sunset, the city grew calm. Lanterns glowed in courtyards. The sound of the sea softened, and scholars climbed observatory towers or rooftop terraces. From these vantage points, they charted the heavens. For astronomers, the stars were both practical and profound. Navigation, timekeeping, and religious rituals all depended on accurate celestial knowledge. Sailors needed the stars to guide their ships. Mosques required exact timings for prayer, and calendars needed to know when months began. The empire's rhythm depended on the heavens. Pajamas in the observatory Y. Then the pajamas. Here we must understand Ottoman scholarly culture. Many astronomers worked long hours, late into the night. Observations required patience waiting for a star to cross a meridian, or a planet to emerge from behind the horizon. Rather than change into stiff, ceremonial robes, scholars often wore lighter, looser garments in private. These were the early ancestors of pajamas, which themselves had origins in Persian and Indian nightwear. The Ottomans adopted them with enthusiasm, appreciating both comfort and practicality. Imagine a scholar reclining on a low divan, ink pot by his side, robe draped, loosely, slippers kicked off. The stars wheeled overhead while he made careful notes by candlelight. Pajamas were not a sign of laziness. They were a tool of focus. A relaxed body, after all, produced steadier hands and clearer eyes. Thus, a humorous rumor began. Ottoman astronomers preferred to chart the heavens in their sleepwear. Others said it was simply practical. No one wished to wrestle with layers of velvet robes at midnight when trying to record the position of Saturn. The instruments of night comfortable. Clothing was only part of the picture. Ottoman observatories were filled with instruments of precision. Astrolabes, intricate brass devices that could measure the altitude of stars. Quadrants, large wall-mounted tools for fixing a star's height above the horizon. Celestial globes, beautiful spheres showing constellations, often in gilt and enamel. The most famous Ottoman observatory was the Taki Aldin Observatory in Istanbul. Built in 1577 under Sultan Murad III, Taki Aldin, a brilliant polymath, used massive instruments to study the heavens, producing detailed star charts. He also wrote about clocks, mathematics, and optics. One can imagine him perhaps, not literally, in pajamas. Though rumors enjoyed suggesting it leaning over his instruments in the quiet hours of the night. His assistants, perhaps wrapped in warm robes against the chill, waited patiently to record measurements. The scene was part science, part poetry. A group of scholars, half asleep, yet fully alert to the sky, sketching the rhythms of eternity. Pajamas and poetry. The Ottoman world loved blending science with poetry. A star chart was not only a mathematical tool, it was also a work of art. Many charts included delicate calligraphy, gold leaf, and miniature paintings of constellations. To wear pajamas while creating such beauty was not absurd, it was fitting. Pajamas, loose and flowing, blurred the line between sleep and wakefulness, and astronomy, too, blurred that line. Studying the stars required both precision and imagination, both mathematics and wonder. It is no surprise, then, that poets often described astronomers as dreamers. Some even joked that pajama-wearing scholars were not really scientists at all, but poets who happened to carry compasses. The two professions were not so different. Both spent nights awake. Both scribbled on paper. Both listened for whispers from the sky. Night as a teacher in Ottoman Istanbul. Night was not merely a time of rest, it was a time of knowledge. Scholars studied the heavens. Sufi mystics meditated. Poets wrote verses. Sailors prepared for voyages. Pajamas became a symbol of this nocturnal culture. Relaxed, private, unhurried. While Europe later imagined astronomy as a pursuit of stern men in stiff collars, the Ottomans approached it with softness. To study the stars was to live with them, to spend long nights watching patiently, half dreaming, half awake. Pajamas were simply the natural clothing of this life. And so, as the empire's domes gleamed by day, its observatories whispered by night, pajama-clad scholars traced constellations, mapped planets, and calculated eclipses. Their charts did not just guide ships and calendars, they also carried the warmth of human comfort, the quiet humor of men who studied eternity while wearing their sleepwear. Taqi al-Din's dream observatory, when Sultan Murad III approved the construction of an observatory in 1577. It was not a small gesture. He was granting resources, land, and prestige to one of the most ambitious scientific projects in the empire. The man at the heart of it was Taqi al-Din ibn Muf, a scholar of extraordinary range. The polymath in pajamas Taqi al-Din was not only an astronomer. He wrote on mathematics, mechanics, engineering, optics, medicine, and even the art of making clocks. He was, as one might say today, the kind of person who collected hobbies until his study was overflowing with half-finished inventions. One can easily imagine him late at night, surrounded by papers, instruments, and cups of cooling sherbet, his long robe exchanged for something lighter and looser. Pajamas, after all, made sense for a man who lived half his life in the hours after midnight. His assistants, perhaps less enthusiastic about sleepless vigils, likely dozed in corners until their master called for a measurement. The observatory was not simply a workplace, was a home for the night. Candles flickered, pens scratched, and men padded softly in slippers across marble floors. Instruments as large as houses. The Istanbul Observatory was filled with grand devices. Unlike today's telescopes, which peer with glass lenses, these instruments relied on geometry, angles, and enormous scales. A giant armillary sphere, its rings representing the celestial circles. Mural quadrants fixed to walls, stretching higher. Then a man, azimuthal quaders that allowed precise measurements of planetary movement. These devices required patience to use. A star might take hours to move into position. Pajamas, again, made sense. When your task is to wait quietly, staring at the heavens, comfort is not a luxury, but a necessity. The pajama anecdote stories circulated, half serious and half playful, about scholars falling asleep at their posts. One tale told of a young apprentice who nodded off while holding an ink brush, smearing a line across a star chart. Rather than scold him, Taqi al-Din supposedly remarked, "Perhaps the heavens wished to add their own stroke." Such stories humanize what could otherwise seem like a cold world of numbers. Pajamas, too, make the astronomers seem less distant. They were not stern men of marble seriousness, but people with yawns, chilly toes, and a fondness for soft fabrics. The fall of the observatory, however, faced an unlucky fate. Only a few years after its completion, in 1580, it was demolished on orders of the Sultan. Some said the astrologers had predicted victory in wars that did not materialize. Others claimed that court rivals grew jealous of Taqi al-Din's influence. Superstitions about comets and eclipses added to the tension. The appearance of a bright comet in 1577, shortly before plague and political unrest, was seen as a bad omen. And when astronomers, no matter how carefully dressed in pajamas, could not turn omens into victories, their prestige faltered. Thus, the grand observatory was torn down. The instruments were dismantled, the walls pulled apart, and Taqi al-Din's dream ended, pajamas outlasting stone yet, curiously. The image of Ottoman scholars working in comfort, drifting between wakefulness and dreams, suited the empire's culture, even after the observatory's fall. Astronomy continued in smaller ways, on rooftops, in madrasa courtyards, on ship decks. And always there was a sense of intimacy. Pajamas remained the natural costume of night science, a quiet defiance of stiff formality in Europe. Astronomy grew ever more public, with grand telescopes and societies. In the Ottoman world, it remained partly private, something done in courtyards and quiet studies, with tea at one's elbow and slippers on one's feet. A blurred boundary. There is a lesson here. It is that Ottoman astronomy blurred boundaries between science and poetry, between night and day, between waking thought and dream. Pajamas were only a symbol, but they captured something essential, that the pursuit of the stars was as much about living with them as it was about measuring them. Taqi al-Din's observatory did not survive, but the stories of his night vigils did. To imagine him there, robe exchanged for soft cotton, quill scratching against parchment, is to glimpse the humanity of science. Astronomy was not merely cold calculation. It was also warmth, comfort, and the gentle humor of men who knew that the heavens would wait, even if they needed to yawn. The gentle legacy of nighttime astronomy, the observatory of Taqi al-Din, may have been reduced to rubble, but the quiet rhythm of Ottoman astronomy never truly ended. Like a candle snuffed out only to leave a lingering warmth, the practice carried on, modest, private, and always somehow tied to comfort. Stargazing beyond walls with the destruction of the great observatory in 1580, scholars did not abandon their craft. Instead, astronomy returned to smaller scales. Mosques still required careful calculation of prayer times. Navigators still relied on the stars to guide Ottoman ships through the Mediterranean and beyond. And in private homes, scholars kept notes, wrote small treatises, and taught apprentices how to use the astrolabe, that elegant brass disc of circles and pointers. One can imagine them in courtyards, reclining on cushions with a night overhead, dressed in pajamas and shawls, murmuring observations while sipping tea. Science had slipped into the rhythm of daily life, never loud, never grand, but quietly. Persistent pajamas as a symbol. The pajamas themselves, of course, were nothing unusual in the Ottoman world. The word itself comes from Persian pijazmi, meaning leg garment. Loose trousers and robes for nightwear spread through the empire long before Europeans adopted them. Yet, in the story of astronomy, pajamas came to symbolize something more. The blending of scholarship with comfort, of learning with domesticity. In Europe, scholars often presented themselves as austere, stiffly dressed men of reason. In Istanbul, the pajama-clad astronomer suggested a softer image knowledge pursued with warmth and ease. It made astronomy feel less like a distant science and more like a human habit, one that belonged to both scholar and shepherd alike. Echoes. In other cultures, this Ottoman way of mixing pajamas and stars was not unique. Across the world, people measured the heavens in ways that blurred boundaries between science and sleep. In China, astronomers kept night vigils in robes, recording eclipses with brushes dipped in ink. In Persia, poets and mathematicians alike gazed at the stars from palace gardens, their words and calculations interwoven in Europe. Tycho Brahe's great observatory on the island of Hven also required endless night vigils, though Tycho, famously eccentric, preferred elaborate court dress to pajamas. Still, the underlying human experience was the same. Cold nights, weary eyes, ink blots on parchment, and a longing for warmth. Pajamas simply gave the Ottoman version a distinct charm. What remained written, though the observatory was demolished? Taqi al-Din's writings survived. His works on timekeeping, on planetary models, and on the mechanics of clocks circulated quietly among scholars in one treatise. He described mechanical clocks capable of dividing hours into minutes and seconds with unusual accuracy. For a man who spent nights in pajama comfort, he had a sharp sense of exactness. His star charts, though less celebrated than those of European contemporaries, showed a persistence. Even when grand instruments fell, the urge to record the heavens continued. Pajama science. Today, one wanders Istanbul today. There is little visible trace of the observatory, but the pajama legacy lingers in another way, in how we imagine stargazing itself to this day. Astronomy is a hobby often done at home, in backyards, on rooftops, in quiet villages. People carry telescopes onto balconies, spread blankets, sip tea, and peer into the sky. Few wear stiff suits for the occasion. More often, it is pajamas, slippers, or warm robes. In this way, the Ottoman astronomers were not so different from us. They made the night sky part of their ordinary evenings. They brought the cosmos into the realm of comfort. A sleepy conclusion, the story of Ottoman astronomers in pajamas is, at its heart, a reminder that science is not only about triumphs, discoveries, and grand observatories. It is also about yawns, warmth, and the quiet persistence of curiosity. Taqi Alden's observatory may have fallen, but his pajama-clad scholars remain in our imagination. Slippers on their feet, ink stains on their fingers, gazing upward, half waking, half dreaming. It is perhaps the most human way to study the stars. And so, as you drift toward sleep, imagine yourself among them. The marble floor cool beneath you, the sky vast above you, and soft cotton at your sleeves. The stars wait patiently whether you measure them or merely dream of them. The empire of silk and sleep when you think of the Tang dynasty. Your mind might first drift toward golden palaces, trade caravans winding through the Silk Road, or poets like Li by scribbling verses by lamplight. But nestled beneath these more famous stories lies a quieter current of history and almost forgotten practice carried out by the empire's clerks, scribes, and scholars. These were not the keepers of law or tax records, but rather a curious kind of specialist. The men and women who tried to measure and record dreams. And, curiously enough, they did it using silk dot to appreciate why the Tang dynasty would dedicate time and effort to such a strange pursuit. We need to understand the cultural environment of China in the 7th and 8th centuries. The Tang period, lasting from 618 to 907 CE, was an era of flourishing cosmopolitanism. The empire's capital, Chang'an, was one of the largest cities in the world at the time, bustling with Persian traders, Buddhist monks from India, and wandering musicians from Central Asia. The Tang court cultivated scholarship and welcomed the blending of Taoist, Confucian, and Buddhist thought. Amid this intellectual stew, the human dream took on remarkable importance. Dreams were never considered trivial. Confucian scholars might have regarded them as reflections of moral order, a way for the unconscious to reveal lapses in personal virtue. Taoists, meanwhile, saw them as gateways into other states of being, blurred places where a person could glimpse the Tao's hidden currents. Buddhists viewed dreams as both illusions and teachings, or, occasionally, prophetic signs sent by bodhisattvas. Within this context, the Tang dynasty's fascination with dreams was not strange at all. Instead, it felt almost necessary. But how does silk enter this story? After all, silk is usually thought of as a fabric of luxury woven into robes, painted upon by artists and used in imperial gifts. Yet, in Tang times, silk was also a writing medium. While paper had been invented centuries earlier, silk was still prized for its smooth surface and durability. Some government records, poems, and religious texts were brushed onto silk scrolls. So when scribes were asked to keep records of dreams, whether from nobles, monks, or even emperors, they often did so on silk itself. It was not simply writing down the words that mattered, though. A whole process emerged, one which later historians called measuring the dream. Scribes would record not only the content of the dream, but also attempt to weigh its significance, categorize it by type, and note down the precise circumstances under which the dream occurred. The fabric of silk became a sort of canvas where waking logic tried to pin down nighttime wanderings. Imagine yourself for a moment in Chang'an. You are a young scholar official, summoned not to debate taxes or irrigation projects, but to listen. To a prince, describe his dream of wandering through a field of cranes. You unroll a length of cream-colored silk, dip your brush into ink, and carefully inscribe the account. But you don't stop there. The hour of the night, the weather that day, perhaps even what the prince had eaten before sleeping. All these details are considered relevant, for who can know which element might have stirred the images of the night. The methodical aspect is what makes this practice so striking. Dreams were not dismissed as whimsical fancies. They were charted as though they were tides, harvests, or census records. In a society that valued bureaucracy and order, even the chaos of sleep had to be measured. The scribes were expected to make comparisons. Was this dreamlike the crane visions seen by other nobles? Was it auspicious or inauspicious? Did similar dreams appear in older scrolls? Over time, the archives of these silk records grew into small dream-libraries. The social uses of such records were significant. If an official dreamed of floods or earthquakes, the emperor might consult advisors on whether this was a warning from heaven. If a general dreamed of a broken sword, it might be taken as a sign to delay a campaign. Commoners, too, often brought dream reports to Buddhist temples, where monks might consult their own manuals and scrolls. In some monasteries, silk dream records were even offered as donations, laid at the feet of statues, as if to say, "Here is the map of my night. Please help me understand it." One particularly curious feature was the way scribes treated silk itself. They believed the smoothness of silk carried symbolic weight. Unlike rougher paper, silk was thought to hold the dream more purely, as though it could preserve the subtle essence of the night's wandering. Some dream interpreters claimed that the sheen of the silk was itself connected to the sheen of dreams, both soft, slippery, and shifting in the light. A frayed edge or ink blot was seen as a bad omen, while neat brushstrokes on unmarred silk gave the impression of an orderly, interpretable vision. We know of this practice largely through scattered references. The Tang imperial annals mention dreams of emperors and their interpretations. Poets, too, drop hints. Du Fu once wrote of dreams rolled on silk like clouds trapped in ink. Archaeologists have uncovered silk scrolls with strange notations that seem less like poetry and more like private dream charts. Even Taoist manuals speak of methods to record the night visions on silk so that their breath may be weighed. Taken together, these fragments suggest that dream measurement was more than idle fancy. It was woven into the intellectual and bureaucratic fabric of the Tang world. Daily life in the Tang capital was already full of rituals of order tea ceremonies, examinations, court assemblies. The act of recording dreams fit perfectly into this rhythm. For those of us today, it may seem unnecessary or even boring to note what one ate before dreaming of cranes. But to the Tang scribes, it was all part of the same world in which heaven and earth spoke through symbols. And humans had the duty to notice. There's something oddly comforting about this, isn't there? The idea that no dream was too small to be brushed onto silk, preserved with the same care as a government edict. A peasant might forget his dream, but an emperor's was preserved for centuries. The fabric outlasting even the dynasty that produced it. And yet, as with all bureaucratic efforts to measure the unmeasurable, questions linger. Could silk truly capture the fleeting, shadowy quality of dreams? Were the records faithful to what the dreamer actually saw, or were they filtered through scribal interpretations? And what happened to all those dream scrolls once dynasties fell and archives crumbled? These questions lead us deeper into the story, for the practice of measuring dreams was not just about record keeping. It was tied to politics, to spirituality, and even to commerce along the Silk Road itself. To understand how we must look beyond the capital and follow the threads of silk outward to monasteries, frontier towns, and the desert caravans that carried both fabric and stories across continents. Dreams, power, and the Silk Road by the middle decades of the Tang dynasty. Dream recording had grown into more than a personal curiosity. It became part of the machinery of power. Rulers have always sought omens, and in Tang China, dreams brushed onto silk could serve as heaven's commentary on politics. Whether these records truly carried cosmic authority or merely reflected human anxieties, they found their way into court debates, religious rituals, and even the bustling trade networks that linked China with the wider world. Let us first consider the emperor himself. The Tang sovereign was seen as the son of heaven, a ruler whose legitimacy depended on maintaining harmony between heaven, earth, and humanity. Any sign of imbalance, drought, an earthquake, or even a dream could be interpreted as heaven's warning. It is no surprise, then, that imperial dreams were treated with utmost seriousness. Court scribes stationed near the throne were expected not only to record official edicts, but also to transcribe the emperor's dreams. If the emperor reported seeing a red dragon circling a tower, the scribes would carefully copy it onto silk, noting the hour and circumstances. Then court astrologers and Confucian scholars would debate its meaning. Was the dragon a symbol of renewal or rebellion? Did the tower represent stability or isolation? These interpretations could subtly shape policy. A favorable reading might encourage the emperor to launch a new campaign. A darker one might lead to prayers, sacrifices, or sudden reforms. One famous case concerns Emperor Xuanzang, who reigned during the height of Tam's prosperity. According to a later chronicle, he dreamed of a palace filled with empty chairs. The dream was brushed onto silk and studied by both Taoist adepts and Confucian ministers. Some said the empty chairs symbolized the absence of loyal ministers, a warning against neglecting governance. Others claimed they represented the ancestors awaiting sacrifice. Xuanzong, reportedly unsettled, ordered both a round of ancestral rituals and a reshuffling of his ministers. Whether or not the dream meant anything, its record had real consequences. But dream records were not only a matter for emperors, nobles, generals, and even provincial governors. Sometimes had their own visions brushed onto silk. General, preparing for a campaign into Central Asia, might report a dream of broken weapons. Rather than ignoring it, scribes would document it, and advisors might argue for delay or caution. In a culture where dreams were considered glimpses of hidden truths, ignoring them could appear reckless. Thus, military strategy sometimes bowed at least partially to silk scrolls filled with nocturnal imagery. The monasteries, too, became hubs of dream recording. Buddhism in Tang China was thriving, attracting lay patrons and imperial support. Temples often served as places where commoners brought their dreams for interpretation. A farmer who dreamed of a glowing lotus might bring an offering of grain to a local temple, asking the monks to consult their manuals. These manuals, often copied on silk or paper, classified dreams into categories: dreams of flight, dreams of water, dreams of animals. Each had its possible meanings, ranging from auspicious fortune to warnings of illness. In some monasteries, dream recording was ritualized. Devotees would write their dreams on strips of silk and offer them at the altar, leaving them as a form of spiritual petition. Monks might then collect these, creating archives of communal dreams. Imagine shelves lined not just with sutras and scriptures, but with stacks of silk filled with ordinary people's night wanderings. Each scrap was both a personal record and a spiritual offering. This brings us to the Silk Road itself. Trade routes did more than carry silk, spices, and horses. They carried ideas and practices. Just as Buddhist sutras traveled from India to China, so too did notions of dream interpretation. Dream manuals from Central Asia, translated into Chinese, began to circulate during the temps. Some bore striking similarities to Mesopotamian or Persian traditions, where dreams had long been treated as omens. The silk dream records of Tang China were not isolated curiosities, but part of a much broader web of human fascination with the unconscious. Silk was uniquely suited for this. Merchants along the Silk Road often carried small bolts of silk knot, only as trade goods, but also as portable writing surfaces. A dream recorded in Chang'an could, in theory, be shown to a scholar in Samarkand, who might compare it to local traditions. While paper was cheaper and more practical, silk had prestige. A dream written on silk carried weight, suggesting that the dream itself was worth the expense. Curiously, some of these records entered diplomacy. Envoys sometimes exchanged dream stories as tokens of goodwill. A Tang ambassador might recount the emperor's favorable dream and present a silk scroll as evidence of heaven's blessing on an alliance. Such exchanges combined political theater with spiritual symbolism, using the ephemeral world of sleep to bolster very real negotiations. Yet beyond politics and trade, dream recording also touched daily life in quieter ways. Aristocratic households sometimes kept their own dream registers. A noblewoman might wake from a troubling vision and summon a family scribe to record it. Later, the scroll might be consulted against older entries, creating a kind of private dream diary across generations. These records, preserved in lacquer boxes, became heirlooms, fragments of a family's unconscious history brushed onto silk, for all its bureaucratic structure. Though dream recording had a paradoxical quality. Dreams are slippery, full of half-remembered shapes and feelings. No matter how careful the brushwork, something was always lost in translation. A scribe might write, "Dreamed of a white bird flying east," but the dreamer remembered not just the bird, but the sound of its wings, the strange light of dawn, the unease in their chest, that could not be brushed onto silk. And so, the dream records stand as both documents and distortions traces of the night filtered through ink and fabric. From the modern perspective, the entire practice can feel both deeply serious and oddly whimsical. On one hand, silk dream records influenced emperors and generals, shaped rituals, and moved along trade routes. On the other, they remind us of the universal human habit of trying to capture the ungraspable. Even today, people keep dream journals or search for interpretations online. The Tang scribes, with their rolls of silk and fine brushes, were not so different from us, except their records gleamed with the sheen of silk, and their audience included emperors by the late Tang period. As the dynasty faced rebellions and political decline, dream records took on a darker tone. Chronicles mention anxious visions of falling stars, collapsing buildings, and rivers turning to dust. Scribes still brushed them carefully onto silk, but one senses the weight of unease pressing down. In a way, the archives of dreams mirrored the empire itself, once bright with cranes and lotuses, later shadowed with omens of collapse. And yet, even as Tang rule waned, the practice of dream recording did not vanish entirely. Some of it flowed into Song dynasty traditions, while Buddhist temples continued to maintain dream manuals. A few fragments of silk scrolls survived in desert caves, preserved in the dry sands of Dunhuang. When rediscovered centuries later, these scraps gave modern scholars a fleeting glimpse into the intimate world of Tang dreams. It is a strange thought. Across centuries, across dynasties, the fragile medium of silk has carried not only art and scripture, but also someone's dream of a bird or a tower or an empty chair. Dreams that once shaped decisions of emperors now lie quietly in museums, unread by those who sleep today. The afterlife of silk dreams by the time the Tang dynasty gave way to the Song. The practice of brushing dreams onto silk had already begun to fade, lighter and better suited to the growing bureaucratic appetite for documents. Silk, once the noble surface for sacred records and delicate brushstrokes, became too costly for something as fleeting as a dream. Yet the traces of that old habit lingered, quietly folded into temples, tucked away in desert caves, and occasionally left behind in household chests that no one thought to clear. What survived from this era tells us something not only about the Tang, but also about the strange durability of dreams. Most dreams vanish within moments of waking, slipping through our fingers like mist. Yet a few brushed onto silk by a careful hand, survived deserts, dynasties, and centuries of neglect. That survival is almost as dreamlike as the content itself. One of the great treasures for historians of dreams came not from a palace archive, but from a dusty cave in Dunhuang, a Silk Road outpost. There, in the early 20th century, explorers stumbled upon a sealed chamber filled with manuscripts. Among the sutras, contracts, and ritual texts were fragments of silk and paper dream records. Some were personal small scraps where someone had written, "Dreamed of my mother bringing water." Others were more formal, recounting visions of emperors or temple rituals. Many of these fragments are difficult to read, their ink faded or their fibers frayed, and yet the very act of their survival is striking. These were not documents meant for eternity. They were whispers of sleep, not declarations of law or scripture. And still, because someone brushed them onto silk, they endured. Scholars who examined these records found a curious mixture of the ordinary and the cosmic. One entry notes a dream of chasing geese across a field. Another records the appearance of Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, radiating light. The juxtaposition is both amusing and profound. People cared enough to record both the trivial and the sacred. It reminds us that in sleep, the line between the ridiculous and the sublime is very thin. As dynasties shifted, the interpretation of dreams also shifted. In Song times, Neo-Confucian scholars grew skeptical of overly mystical readings. Dreams, they argued, were reflections of one's inner thoughts rather than heavenly messages. A general might still consult a monk about a troubling vision, but the habit of presenting silk scrolls at court waned. Paper records replaced silk, and private dream diaries became more common than public ones. The grandeur of silk dreams gradually dissolved into more modest traditions. Still, the memory of the practice lingered in literature. Poets of the later dynasties sometimes alluded to dream scrolls as a metaphor. A Tang poet might once have sighed, "My dream brushed onto silk, but you are far away." Centuries later, a Ming poet might echo the image in verse, wistful that the brush could not capture the fullness of longing. Even after the practice itself faded, its symbolism endured. One might wonder, why silk? Why devote such a precious material to something so ephemeral? Perhaps the answer lies in the tension itself. Dreams are fleeting. Silk is enduring. To place one upon the other was to honor the fragility of sleep with the dignity of permanence. It was an attempt, however futile, to make the insubstantial last. There is something deeply human in that. Across cultures, we build little rituals to catch dreams before they dissolve. Some keep dream journals by their bedsides. Some tell their morning dreams to friends or spouses before memory slips away. Some seek meanings in dictionaries of symbols. The Thames scribes simply did the same with silk, brushes, and ink. And here we find the quietest beauty of the practice. Even if the dream records no longer swayed emperors or guided generals, they remain as traces of people, real people, who closed their eyes in the dark, wandered in the land of sleep, and cared enough to leave a mark of it behind. To read a dream scroll today is to overhear, across 1,000 years, someone murmuring in their sleep. Archaeologists handling these fragments must do so carefully. Silk is fragile, and the ink often bleeds into the weave. Unrolling one of these scraps, knowing it was once placed at the side of a bed, or laid on a desk by candlelight, carries, possess. It is not a law, not a sermon, not an account of taxes. It is a dream, a person's passing vision, preserved against all odds. Imagine, for a moment, Thames scholar, waking in a dim courtyard room. The night air still cool, the oil lamp flickering. Lo, they rise, reach for a brush, and carefully unroll a strip of silk. They pause, trying to grasp the fading images. Was it a bird or a flame? Did the tower fall or stand? Then, with deliberate strokes, they record it. Dreamed of a bird flying east, wings shining like jade. They blow gently to dry the ink, roll the silk, and set it aside. Soon enough, the dream itself is gone from their mind. But the silk remains. Centuries later, perhaps we rediscover that same strip. The scholar is long forgotten. Their dream no longer guides policy, no longer brings them comfort or warning. Yet we can still read it. We can still imagine them sleeping, waking, writing. We can still hear, faintly, the rustle of silk in the night. Thus, the afterlife of Tang dreams is not only historical, but poetic. It reminds us that sleep connects us across time. The emperor dreaming of empty chairs, the farmer dreaming of a glowing lotus, the scholar dreaming of jade wings. Of them sleep as we sleep, dream as we dream. Their silk is fragile, but the act of dreaming is endless. Today, when we close our eyes, we carry forward the same impulse. We may not use silk or call scribes, but we still wonder at the strangeness of dreams. We still wake, puzzled or amused, carrying fragments into daylight. The Tang dynasties. Dream records are less about answers than about the universal desire to give shape to the unshapable. And so, in the quiet, as you drift into your own sleep, remember that others once did the same scribes dipping brushes, emperors whispering their visions, monks unrolling scrolls, families keeping dream diaries. Their dreams, brushed into silk, have long faded. Yours, tonight, may fade too. But in the endless chain of sleepers, dreamers, and recorders, the night is never truly silent.